Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a story that really, I think, just grabs you right from the start.
Definitely.
And we'll be looking at the tragic case of Sally Clark.
Absolutely.
And, it's a case where you see a life that's completely overturned by the deaths of her two infant sons.
Yeah.
And you really see a justice system that, in a lot of ways, failed her at every turn.
Yeah. You really see how things can go wrong and why this case still matters even today.
Yeah, we've got so many sources for this one.
We do.
We've got court transcripts, we've got medical reports, we've even got some social commentary from the time.
Right.
So we can really kind of get into what went wrong.
Yeah, and understand the atmosphere at the time,
Well,
what was going on that led to all this.
What's so striking about this case, even looking back at it now, is just how so many different things
Right.
seemingly came together
Yeah.
to create this terrible miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it's like a perfect storm of
Yeah.
events.
So let's start with the facts.
Okay.
Sally Clark was living what seemed to be a really great life
A happy life.
with her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And they had their young son, Christopher.
Right.
And tragically, he died very suddenly
He did.
at just 11 weeks old.
Very young.
And at the time, doctors, they attributed his death
Yeah.
to SIDS,
Right.
sudden infant death syndrome,
Yeah.
which is a diagnosis that's given when an infant dies and there's no explanation,
Under a year old.
right under a year old.
And they just can't figure out why.
And there's just no identifiable cause.
Yeah.
And elegies is just heartbreaking
It really is.
for so many families.
Yeah.
And even back then, they didn't know that much about it.
Not as much as we know now.
Yeah, it was even less developed than it is now.
Sadly, it still happens.
But then, just a year later,
Oh, God.
tragedy struck again.
Yeah,
Sally and her husband had another son,
they did.
Harry.
Yes.
and he died suddenly as well,
He did.
at only 8 weeks old.
8 weeks.
So two infant deaths in the same family,
Right.
both attributed to SIs.
Yeah,
It's easy to see how this would raise red flags.
definitely.
But how did this lead to Sally being accused of murder?
Well, this is where things took a turn.
Yeah.
After Harry's death, the police started investigating Sally,
Okay.
and the prosecution brought in this really prominent pediatrician,
Okay.
Sir Roy Meadow.
Okay.
He's like an expert witness.
Right.
And he testified that the statistical probability
Okay.
of two infants dying from SIDS in the same family was 1 in 73 million.
Wow.
So basically saying it's almost impossible for
Yeah.
these deaths to be natural.
1 in 73 million. That must have sounded
Yeah.
really damning to the jury.
Especially coming from this well-respected medical professional.
Exactly.
But the thing is, the jury didn't know
Yeah.
that his calculations were flawed.
Okay.
Meadow made some incorrect assumptions,
Uh-huh.
and he didn't consider any other potential explanations.
So this flawed testimony combined with, I guess, just society's views at the time.
Yeah, there was a tendency to view mothers with suspicion
Really?
when it came to infant death.
Wow.
And so it created this perfect storm for Sally.
So you're saying even back then there was a bias against mothers in cases like this?
Sadly, yes.
Wow.
The idea of the bad mother has been around for centuries.
Right.
And in some ways, Sally became a scapegoat for
Yeah.
society's anxieties around infant mortality.
Yeah.
It's easier to blame someone
Mhm.
than to confront something so complex like
Yeah.
SIDS.
So here you have a grieving mother, already devastated by the loss of her two children, now being accused of murdering them,
Right.
based on what we know now is flawed evidence.
It's just terrible.
So how did she cope with this? What happened at the trial?
Well, the trial itself was this huge media spectacle.
Oh, wow.
It was a frenzy. Yeah. And, public opinion had really turned against her,
Oh, why?
despite her saying she was innocent. Meadows' testimony and the biases at the time it was all too much.
So what happened? Was she convicted?
She was.
Oh, my God.
In 1999, Sally Clark was found guilty
Wow.
of murdering both of her sons, and she was sentenced to life in prison.
It's just such a chilling example of how,
Yeah.
flawed science
Right.
and societal prejudice
All came together.
can just lead to such a devastating injustice.
It really is.
I mean, it's hard to fathom what she must have gone through
Yeah.
to lose your children and then on top of that be labeled a murderer
Right.
and then face spending the rest of your life in prison.
Yeah.
It's almost unimaginable.
You can't.
But I understand there's more to this story,
Yeah.
that the truth eventually came to light.
It did.
Okay.
While Sally was in prison, her family and her supporters, they just never gave up hope.
Yeah.
They kept pushing for the case to be reviewed.
Good for them.
And finally, in 2003, there was a breakthrough.
Oh, wow.
A group of medical experts,
Okay.
independent medical experts, re-examined the evidence,
Okay.
and they found something really crucial.
Okay, what did they find?
It turned out that Harry, Sally's second son,
Mm-hmm.
he had this bacterial infection
Okay.
that was known to be a risk factor for sudden infant death.
So this was information that was in Harry's medical records,
It was.
but it was never brought up at the trial.
It wasn't.
My God.
So it completely undermined Meadows' claim that two SID's deaths in the same family were impossible.
Wow.
It just wasn't true.
So there was a plausible medical explanation for Harry's death the whole time.
Right.
That was just missed.
Yeah. Or ignored.
Wow. What about Christopher?
Sally's first son.
Yeah.
Well, further medical reviews showed that he may have also had an undiagnosed infection
Oh, wow.
that could have contributed to his death.
So the evidence was complicated,
It was.
but it showed a completely different story.
Than what was presented at the trial.
This is incredible. So with this new evidence, I assume Sally's conviction was overturned.
It was.
Okay, good.
The Court of Appeal quashed her conviction
Okay.
in 2003.
Yeah.
They acknowledged the new medical findings,
Mm-hmm.
and they said that Meadows' testimony was flawed.
Wow. So after spending more than 3 years in prison
For something she didn't do.
for a crime she did not commit,
Yes.
Sally was finally free.
It's amazing.
I'm so relieved to hear that at least she got out of prison.
Yeah.
But I can only imagine what those years must have been like.
Yeah.
Can you ever really recover from something like that?
That's a really good question, and it's something we should consider carefully.
Yeah.
While Sally was free,
Yeah.
it really took a toll on her. The
Yeah.
trauma of losing her sons,
Mm-hmm.
the injustice of the trial.
The public shaming
Yeah.
and then prison life
All of that.
really impacted her mental and physical health.
Yeah,
It's heartbreaking to think about what she went through.
it really is.
So what happened to Sally after she was released?
Well, sadly, she never really recovered.
Oh, gosh.
The damage was just too much. She struggled with PTSD, depression,
Mm-hmm.
alcoholism,
Wow.
and even though her name was cleared, there was still this stigma around her,
Right.
this suspicion.
That never went away.
No,
And then in 2007,
just 4 years after she was released,
oh my God.
Sally took her own life.
Oh, that's devastating.
It really is.
You know, her story really shows the lasting impact that injustice can have.
On individuals and their families.
Even though the truth came out, it couldn't undo the damage.
Couldn't.
But I know her story didn't end there.
No, it didn't.
What happened after Sally's death? Was there any accountability for the mistakes that were made?
Well, Sally's case, along with other similar cases, where mothers were wrongly accused,
Right.
really sparked some change in the UK legal system.
Oh, wow. Okay, good.
Yeah, it forced this national conversation
Yeah.
about expert witnesses and infant death and bias in the justice system.
So what were some of the concrete changes that were made?
One of the biggest things was how expert testimony is handled in court.
Okay.
Meadows' flawed calculations really exposed how the system could be swayed
Right.
by these persuasive but unscientific arguments.
Yeah.
So they put in place new guidelines to
Yeah.
make sure that expert testimony is really vetted
Uh-huh.
and based on good science.
It makes sense. I mean, it's one thing for an expert to have an opinion,
Right.
but it's another for that to be presented as fact.
Especially when it's a matter of life or death.
Exactly. So what about the bias against mothers?
Well, Sally's case and others, it did raise awareness
Okay.
about the pressures and prejudices mothers face,
Yeah.
especially when dealing with infant loss.
Right.
It challenged that perfect image of motherhood
Yeah.
and forced society to see that mothers are human too.
Yeah.
They make mistakes.
And they need support
Yes, exactly.
rather than blame.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder
Yeah.
that behind every case,
Mm-hmm.
there are real people
Real fam.
dealing with unimaginable grief
Yeah.
and loss.
Sally's story is tragic.
It is.
It shows how the pursuit of justice can go so wrong.
And the impact
The devastating consequence
of
of...
those mistakes.
Yeah.
But it's also a story about resilience,
Yes.
the love of family,
Yeah.
and fighting for the truth.
Even when it seems impossible.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Sally Clark case,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just left with such sadness,
Yeah.
but also I think a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
Sadness for the lives lost
Mhm.
and the injustice,
Right.
but hope that her story
Yeah.
will keep reminding us,
Of what's important.
to think critically, to question what we believe.
And to fight for a more just world.
Exactly. And I think maybe the most important thing
Yeah.
is to approach these really tough issues with humility, knowing that we don't know everything
Right.
and that our own biases can really cloud our judgment.
Absolutely. We have to create a system that protects the innocent,
Yes,
honors the truth.
and upholds justice for everyone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Sally Clark case.
It's been a really important conversation
We hope this is giving you a better understanding
of this complex and tragic story.
and its impact on the legal system and really on society as a whole.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.